Okay, can people hear me? Okay. I didn't quite get all of that intro, so I hope that this is my cue to start. Good morning. We're gonna ease it down a little bit, talk a little bit about some jazz. In his 1932 hit "Reefer Man," Cab Calloway asks his audience, "Have you ever met that funny reefer man?" Over several verses, Calloway describes the reefer man in increasingly fantastical contexts. The reefer man might say he swam to China, or try to sell you South Carolina, or may say he walks the ocean, call watermelons pickles, or even, if he takes a sudden mania, give you Pennsylvania. The reference to mania, or other forms of psychotic break, was, by then, long recognized as a physiological effect of the drug on the human body. But to some, like Federal Bureau of Narcotics Chief Harry Anslinger, these manias wouldn't produce absurd land transaction offers, but instead could directly cause countless murders, suicides, and other crimes of various types. My presentation today will look at the tensions between these competing viewpoints about the effect of marijuana intoxication on the body. These competing viewpoints and the power dynamics between them in the 30s and 40s set the stage for the emergence of what we now recognize as the war on drugs, based on the more Anslinger-esque assumptions about drug use, and specifically its supposed connection to social disorder. But while the historical study of this dynamic has highlighted and unpacked the problematic motivations that privileged the viewpoint of people who perhaps never used the drug, and certainly were not familiar with the drug's specific sets and settings, these analyses have yet to unpack the point of view of people who actually used the drug, or who were at least marginally aware of its subculture. As this conference is centered on pop culture and ecstatic states of the body after the 50s, my purpose is perhaps to introduce an origin story of the production of ecstatic bodily states via drug intoxication, alongside the playing of jazz music in the 1930s and 40s. And we'll see the productions of these states in the context of critique and resistance. Drug intoxication has been traditionally understood as a binary contrasting the medical with the non-medical, or recreational. And the language that informs our general understanding of the role of drugs in modern society is tainted by this oversimplified binary. Here, the concept of medical use has a specific regulatory connotation in the language of 20th century international drug control, and is as much a regulatory classification as it is a functional goal-oriented practice, like the treatment or cure for some specific treatment, symptom, or ailment. Now, Alexine Fleck has argued that intoxication as a form of solution-seeking has been unfairly categorized as self-medicating to reflect that problematic binary. And I argue similarly that intoxication is not merely a physiological process, but it is also cultural, social, and even political. Within this framework, intoxication and seeking intoxication isn't merely a result or a byproduct of socioeconomic marginalization, but can also be understood as an affirmative expression of agency for poor, marginalized communities, and should be understood on its own terms. The important factor here is that intoxication is the expression. Creating an aberrant physiological state is the solution. So in the 1920s and 30s in the United States was an era of protest and youthful rebellion, as well as a period of intense social and cultural change. The suffrage victories in 1919 ushered in a new era of political participation, while the Red Scare threatened to end another. Prohibition was a significant political and cultural rupture, while massive immigration spurred restrictive legislation, and the Great Migration saw thousands of African Americans fleeing Jim Crow in the South, leading to similarly restrictive legislation in northern cities. The 20s exacerbated these conditions, reigniting a nativist and xenophobic politics, and saw the economy overheat several times, resulting in the Great Depression. And it was into this socio-cultural context that reefer madness gained its momentum, culminating in the passage of the Marijuana Tax Act in 1937, which effectively outlawed cannabis with a prohibitive regulatory tax. Harry Anslinger, chief at the Federal Bureau of Narcotics, was largely responsible for disseminating information about cannabis, both directly and indirectly, creating a sense of urgency to pass this legislation for reasons that Kathleen Friedel has pointed out had much more to do with the dramatic changes taking place in American governance, both at home and overseas, than it did with the actual dangers that Anslinger highlighted in his hardline, racist public claims about the drug's effects. The ready acceptance of these claims by a growing middle class, increasingly concerned about protecting their children from a long list of threats, assured that while the premises behind reefer madness would be mocked by subsequent generations, its underlying assumptions about the dangers of drug use and the role of law enforcement in keeping those dangers at bay deeply embedded an anti-marijuana consensus in the United States that, apart from a brief period in the 60s and 70s, has only been broken recently, and still quite haltingly. Now, one of the more insidious ways that Anslinger generated public sympathy for his hardline stance among his targeted constituency anyway, was to link the use of marijuana with the rise in popularity of jazz music. Now, by the time Cab Calloway sang about the manic man who said he swam to China in 1932, jazz music was becoming mainstream. Jazz has its roots in Southern musical styles like ragtime, blues, folk music, and it challenged classical musical conventions with a improvisational and polyrhythmic flair. Appealing to young listeners, jazz changed the way that Americans consumed music. But its popularity and the lifestyles of its most successful practitioners raised warning flags among authority figures, none less than Anslinger. As the genre became a staple of Americana, it was often a scapegoat for delinquency, sexual depravity, and of course, drug use. And this pattern would be repeated in future generations, as we've already seen with rock, rap, punk, and other emergent musical genres. Excuse me. And as with these other genres, this association in part reflected elements of the jazz culture itself, as many jazz musicians openly used and wrote about drugs, including cannabis, in their songs. Louis Armstrong, one of the most popular jazz musicians of the era, was known to use marijuana. In 1929, he composed Muggles, a song whose title was a popular slang term for a joint, specifically in New Orleans. He even served a 9-day jail sentence in 1931 for violating California's Poison Act, which outlawed possession of marijuana. His relationship to the drug was well known and even generated 2 whole chapters of one of his biographies. As the years went on, many of the most popular and well-traveled jazz musicians either distanced themselves from marijuana use, and some, including Cab Calloway, even fought against it throughout the 50s and 60s. An explicit effort to eradicate marijuana use by jazz musicians emerged in the 50s, and artists like Cab Calloway warned the jazz community in a 1951 issue of Ebony magazine about, quote, marijuana and narcotics wrecking lives and ruining careers, unquote. And so while we won't attribute jazz music to the rise in marijuana use among its participants, and especially its listeners, we can identify a consistent pattern in descriptions of the oral environment in which marijuana was used, because it was often filled with jazz music. Now, while it's hard to generalize about the methods and settings for drug use during this period because of the lack of evidence, the evidence that does exist suggests that a popular option among users was to congregate with other users in a small private residence that came to be known as a tea pad. An evolution of the jazz-era rent parties, combined with a Prohibition-era speakeasy, tea pads ran the gamut in terms of frills and amenities, But generally, they were furnished with comfortable seating, soft lighting, and of course, jazz on the phonograph. Mayor Berger, writing for the New Yorker in 1938, visited a gray stone tenement on 140th Street in New York, describing it as a middle-class pad. There were 4 rooms with 9 couches set against the cracked cream-colored walls, with a few limp easy chairs to handle the overflow. A blue bulb from the phonograph illuminated the space, and to fill the aural space were, quote, special recordings of viper or weed songs with weird ritualistic themes, unquote. A few months after the Berger article appeared in the New Yorker, the mayor of New York, Fiorello LaGuardia, created a special committee to study the marijuana problem in New York. And their findings, published in 1944, described an entire network of T-pads in the city. Now, finding one meant connecting with the right people, and the undercover New York Police Department officers who surveyed the city for the committee were able to make these connections in, quote, pool rooms, bars and grills, dime dance halls, other dance halls, theaters, roller skating rinks, subways, public toilets, parks, and docks, unquote. But as long as one knew the location, there was very little attempt at exclusivity. T-pads were safe zones for marijuana users, free from the prying eyes on the street, notably law enforcement, but were also, to use Kevin Mumford's term, interzones. The T-pads, more so than the speakeasies of just a few years prior, and the sex districts as described by Mumford before that, did not attempt to cater to any specific socioeconomic clientele. A single T-pad could serve men and women, people of all backgrounds and varying social classes. In the classic 1981 oral history of drug users, addicts who survived, several of the interviewed subjects recalled their T-pad experience explicitly from the 30s and 40s. John recalled frequenting T-pads for the social experience. Quote, when I was a kid, we used to go to a reefer pad and buy marijuana and smoke in the pad. We'd sit there listening to a jukebox or a phonograph. We'd listen all day. We'd spend maybe 6-7 hours in there smoking. Now, to critics, what went on in the T-pads was the height of debauchery. For years, as Isaac Campos has shown, knowledge produced about marijuana had created a consensus on the ways in which marijuana had disastrous effects on the body. According to this knowledge, cannabis led to sexual deviance, violence, insanity, and death. But incidentally, it also led to more jazzy jazz. In his infamous Assassin of Youth article written with Courtney Cooper in 1937, Anslinger explained this phenomenon. Quote, the jazz musician who uses reefers finds that the musical beat seemingly comes to him quite slowly, thus allowing him to interpolate any number of improvised notes with comparative ease. Unquote. To Anslinger, the need to use cannabis to perform was, though ultimately fleeting, incredibly effective, allowing users to achieve that almost manic state. That marijuana could cause either murder or maybe great jazz was an important conceptual coup for the future of enforcement of marijuana laws in years to come. Newspaper reports consistently reference the arrests of jazz musicians and often note the presence of jazz music at the locations where raids and mass arrests occurred. And these highlighted the ways that these problematic associations influence enforcement strategies in subsequent decades. The most famous is the story of Gene Krupa's 1943 arrest for possession that captivated a national audience and led to the creation of a 1950s film, The Gene Krupa Story, which loosely revolved around that incident. It's early, mouth is dry. And though we should continue to hold these racist and classist views with considerable contempt, especially in the way that they guided police enforcement, the sheer volume of incidents that either directly involved jazz artists or occur in the presence of jazz music does indicate a clear relationship. And since they often remain the only clear accounts of the activities going on inside of a TPAD, it's really difficult, to be honest, to evaluate the presence of the ecstatic states inside. But if we look at jazz lyrics and the ways that songwriters spoke to their listeners' experience, in the relatively few cases in which they do, we can see their words evoking the TPAD and suggesting some alternative possibilities for what goes on in them. As Madeline Powers has shown, despite the ephemeral nature of song lyrics, historians can still glean important insights from them. Here, some of the overwrought verses in some of these songs can easily be dismissed in representational terms as being part of the style of the genre. Cab Calloway's Reefer Man Swimming to China, referenced in the opening, is an example. But some of the more mundane descriptions in jazz songs evoke both the TPAD and the set and setting in which TPAD patrons partook of their drug of choice. With this approach, we can see jazz lyrics placing the use of cannabis within the context of the fraught social situation in these largely poor, underserved urban communities during the Great Depression, suggesting deeper political, economic, and social critiques for which marijuana use and intoxication producing an ecstatic bodily state became a solution. Another 1932 Cab Calloway song called The Man from Harlem seems to be set in a typical TPAD and references the anticipation among the patrons of the Man from Harlem's arrival with, quote, frails chewing on their fingernails, forgetting about their bills, waiting for the Man from Harlem, unquote. Now, when he arrives, quote, everybody cleared a space and big broad smiles across their face. Everybody loves the Man from Harlem, unquote. He's greeted by two women who are sitting on the kitchen floor. Quote, and they said, I'm kinda low. And he said, I've got just what you need. Come on, sisters. Light up on these weeds and get high and forget about everything. The song Reefer Hound Blues by Curtis Jones in 1968 was more explicit. He seems to be describing the ability of marijuana in easing the burdens of economic deprivation due to its effect on the body. Quote, my whole body... let me start that again. Quote, my whole body's scent, Lord. I feel like I'm a millionaire. If I'm broke, I still got money. If I'm hungry, I don't even care, unquote. Fats Waller also commented on marijuana's ability to ease economic pain in the 1930s song A Viper's Drag. Quote, you don't give a damn if you don't pay rent. Light that tea, let it be if you're a viper. Now, these lines seem to evoke a familiar image of poor, marginalized urban residents who may lack a job and money, perhaps be threatened with eviction or hunger regularly, to just light that tea and let it be. Now, independently, these sources seem poor indications of motivations for marijuana users, but taken together with the proper context, I think they begin to shed some light on some possibilities. Now, marijuana use was motivated in part by economic, political, and social erasure, and the physiological effects produced a bodily state that could potentially cause someone to forget about their troubles. Whether it is the lack of economic resources, anxiety about marginalization, or fears about the future in Great Depression America, marijuana served as an option, more than just a coping mechanism, in the absence of adequate healthcare infrastructure due to the increasing isolation of these marginalized groups from the benefits of the nascent New Deal liberal state. At the same time, this analysis lends some balance to claims by authorities that cannabis and jazz were closely connected in ways that increased incidence of crime and disorder. During the 1930s, many jazz musicians captured the emerging marijuana culture in their pursuit of ecstatic bodily states. And they framed that culture in the context of protest and resistance. And even as many turned against some of the excesses of that culture in the 1950s and beyond, which, it should be noted, were much more concerned about the proliferation of heroin addiction than marijuana use. were nevertheless demanding that their use and so, even their subsequent anti-addiction advocacy be celebrated on their terms and not on Harry Anslinger's. And in the improvisational spirit of jazz, playing in the midst of the production of ecstatic bodily states among users in some random 1930s teapad, we have to consider it possible that the choice of to use cannabis was tied to specific experiential effects that the drug produced in its users. If that's true, could we suggest then that the time bending, memory erasing, and euphoric effects were exactly what was missing in their lives during this period? Thank you.
Great. Thank you. It's always hard to speak out into the Zoom audience, but I might ask for the Zoom participants if Bob Beach would like to add or respond or expand.
So I actually didn't hear many of the questions at all. So maybe if you could just sort of restate, I could give some of my.
Um, what spaces in form of sorry, what spaces and what forms of exploring spaces were addressed in the contributions, and I of course addressed your TPAD example, and how do they connect to the discussion on ecstasy in your perspective?
Yeah, and I think just based on some of the comments from the other presenters, I think the difference in my presentation or my research is just the lack of evidence, right? A lot of the evidence of your presentation, I love the audio. It seemed like you had a lot of perspectives from the participants. My participants don't really leave much of a record. So it's kind of difficult to kind of get into the TPAD to see what's going on, and indeed we're relying, or I'm relying largely on police reports, investigative reports from the mayor's committee, jazz lyrics, which is perhaps the worst way to sort of determine how things are going down inside the TPAD. You also have the oral histories, but yeah, the participants are by now long dead. So it's really, really difficult to access those spaces, perhaps more difficult than it was to access those spaces back then. But I do kind of think that through sort of reading beyond or reading against the grain from some of these official sources, especially with Isaac Campbell's great work, Homegrown, about some of the knowledge production about maybe not ecstatic bodily states, but dangerous bodily states can kind of be read alongside some of these other pieces of evidence that can give a slightly more accessible view of this world that I'm trying to explore.
I have this little question regarding the sources on TPADs,
Mm.
because when you were explaining that, I was thinking of a biography I read last year, the various volumes of the great writer and performer Maya Angelou.
Mm.
And in her descriptions, yeah, similar situations. They were never called TPADs, but it was clear that you consume marijuana and various other kinds of drugs. And it reminded me of these descriptions.
Mm-hmm.
So my question would be, um, are there enough or sufficient personal memoirs, diaries, fictionalized descriptions that would allow an approach to that? Are you aware of that? Is this a recurring topic?
It is a recurring topic, and I do think that there probably. So the problem is that there probably are a number of these sorts of accounts out there. It's just a question of finding them, right? Because they're not well archived. They're certainly not going to be, sitting in a section. Hey, these are people that talked about marijuana. But for example, the Jazz Institute at Rutgers University in Newark, New Jersey, has an oral history of jazz musicians, and there's a whole bunch of them. I had a couple weeks, a couple years ago, to look through some of them, and there are some recollections. And as I mentioned in my talk, unfortunately, due to the political, the legal status of marijuana, when they were being interviewed in the 90s, the tendency was for these people, some of whom I know for a fact, were either arrested or had clear associations with the marijuana culture, who completely disavowed that association in the oral interview. So yeah, it's a lot of sort of digging in, but the other place, and again, this is really problematic in terms of like reliable sources, but it's reading those official sources, police sources, against the grain. And that's kind of coming into shape with my dissertation research, which is proceeding.
Great, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you a lot. Maybe we. Oh, sorry, I don't want to take up the.
Yeah, I would say we open the discussion, and since I'm the chair, I have the privilege to ask the first question. And it's for Ralph and Sebastian, and it's related to this kind of pyramid which you show, which is like the normalization of the specific dance form. And I was wondering, for instance, whether this is kind of a normalization of a specific ecstatic body practice, and whether this had any repercussions on like dancing in the hardcore scene, for instance. When the particular dance style became mainstream, did they change their own style of ecstatic dancing to kind of distinguish themselves?
I would say the influence was clear. I had a comment from Alex from 1991, where he's complaining that Fresh Prince even appear on Red Hot Chili Pepper concerts. So the bands they try to develop their dance style, especially the New York hardcore scene was very creative, but there was a limit, and maybe they even go back and to the old forms, but especially the 1990s, the New York scene had a problem that the CBGBs, for example, closed the doors for the Sunday matinees, the famous concerts. So they had to find new values. They were in a also inner conflict. So it's also here the context which is different, but the dance styles, this repertoire stayed the same.
Would maybe also add that I think it becomes a bit more acrobatic and expressive from the hardcore scene style, but yeah, the moves stay the same. Yeah.
We also have. I just want to let you know that we have. We have some chat comments. Yeah. We have a question for this is from Julie. I don't know if this is you too, but at least for Peter Platt. A question for Bob. Why do you say that jazz lyrics are the worst way to gain insight into the CPAT? What makes them more problematic than other sources?
To be clear, I meant that in the context of just hearing the other presentations when it was a little bit more present. Madeline Powers does a really good job in her book on drinking cultures in immigrant neighborhoods, about thinking about lyrics as legitimate forms of understanding a particular culture. And so, yeah, it's not fundamentally problematic, but compared to getting firsthand accounts from participants as the other two presentations showed. It just kind of put into contrast the distance from my sources compared to some more recent topics is all. But definitely, I think using lyrics, especially lyrics that seem to portray actual circumstances, can be absolutely useful as historical evidence. So I apologize for kind of saying that earlier.
Then we have Julie here. Could the panelists talk about the balances of race in their work? Of subjects are leaning into blackness, while metal and
Thanks for coming
hardcore
back.
bands are into music that's
Thanks for coming
strained
back.
African American rhythm.
And of course, you
Thank
walk
you.
in as soon as they ask
And
you.
also a question for Ralph and Sebastian.
I love
Maybe
you.
I missed it, but I was surprised not to hear a mention of Fugashi, IMK's band of the Minor Threat, and your stance on slam dancing, i.e. giving refunds and ejections to particularly aggressive slam dancers. A lot of YouTube footage of Fugashi stopped mid-song to address mushing.
Yeah, to Fugazi, we wanted to exclude like post-hardcore, but like Ian McKay was the founder of Minor Threat, is the central figure in that, and it's also like you see that I would say from like Erika Fischer-Lichter's perspective, even he can't fully control what's going on in the crowd. So he's trying to address the crowd and he's trying to police the movements, but still he has to give refunds at the end of the concert. So there's this problem. Yeah.
We want to address this point, but we cut it off because of the time issue.
Yeah, for me, there's not much to say about race, actually, because, it's the GDR, so it's like 99% white guys. What I mentioned, very in one sentence is that, the observers ascribe racist slurs, stereotypes to people in a state of trance. So this is very, 100-year-old vocabulary ascribing people losing control over their body as, quote, Indians or barbarians. So there's a connection there to race, but these are terms that were used before to describe jazz music and Beatles fans and so on.
Yes, I agree that the connotation is African American when it comes to my topic, but I think it's important, especially in the context of like thinking about Kevin Mumford's interzones, right? That these are, I think they're sort of ascribed black spaces, but I think the reality is a little bit more complex. And again, without clear evidence, without attendance reports or anything like that. It's hard to determine exactly who participated in these. It's clear that there were different sort of styles of TPAD. A couple of the descriptions that I've heard or that I've read seem to indicate that there's a range of class, range of accommodations in different TPADs. But it doesn't seem, and again, this is without clear evidence to support, but it doesn't seem like there was a specific attempt to make this an exclusively black space. And you have the opportunity for the sort of interracial connection that Mumford kind of emphasized was so important to those kinds of cultures in that time period.
Okay, I would suggest that since we only have 15 minutes left, that we will have three questions combined, or three persons asking questions. So the first round would be Jenny, Detlef, and Sasha, and then we respond to the questions, and then the second round.
I'll need to have to speak up because the speaker decided also to die on us today, so I can't move it.
Sorry, can you not hear me when you speak?
You can also come down to the microphone.
Oh,
I can't move in a master room. I need to connect it to the computer, so I can't move around. Yes, please.
connection that you made between the moving body turning into, like when the body started to move, it became a movement. That was like a link you made, and you also made the link to the straight edge movement, that like out of the body movement came the body discipline. So I would be interested in that link. Like, is it a hypothesis, or is it like a something that we have evidence on? Because especially with the body discipline, I mean, I find it then a very like interesting hypothesis. I was just interested if you have like evidence on the straight edge movement not being parallel, but actually a consequence of the hardcore movement. And the thing about, and to Bob Beach, yeah. I wanted to ask about the agency. That is because you talked about the intoxication being seen as an expression of agency and not just a byproduct of marginalization. But then when you talk about what it actually means, like in the social economic aspect of like the lack of job, rent, fears of evictions, having hunger, and so on, and then being intoxicated, where is actually the agency? Like, how does it like solve the problem? I think you spoke also about like solutions of problems. So this is not like an anti-Mariana statement I'm making here, but the sole fact that people forgot about their anxiety, like where do they actually find political action in that? That were my points.
Okay, first of all, I want to thank all three speakers and the brilliant commentators as well. Joseph? Okay, and I have actually two questions. One to Ralf and Sebastian, which is not so much about aesthetics, but simply another question which I think is obvious. That's about gender. I mean, it was so clear that we are, and you also said it. It's mostly a male scene there, but still, I mean, in your talk, you quoted some of the audiences to calling the participating women as wallflowers, and I was just trying to get you to reflect a bit about that. And my question essentially is, how about the audience of female punk bands? How did they act? Is there a difference or not? The second question would be to Nikolai. I was wondering, and now I'm getting more to the ecstatic topic. I was wondering, in your description of heavy metal in the GDR, we learn quite a lot about the perspective of the state to the heavy metal scene. But I was wondering if there's a big difference between the East German and the West German heavy metal scene in terms of constructing their identity by dancing, by their performance on the dance floor, or their kind of music. So my question, I think, is basically if the political context has an effect on the way ecstatics are constituted.
Yeah, and I have a question for Nikolai and a comment question for Ralf and Sebastian. For Nikolai, one of the persistent cliches about punk fans and heavy metal fans is that the punk fan is usually urban type and the heavy metal person is a rural type. Can you maybe say a little bit about that in terms of the GDR, please? And as for the two of you, I agree with your analysis, and what's really striking is as the 1980s moved into conservatism, one aspect of punk culture, saying no to everything that I spoke about yesterday, really got picked up and turned into a religion as it got into performed by the straight edge movement. It's pointed out, no alcohol, no drugs, etc. It really became religious, and with everything that is religious, what you repress returns in unexpected ways. And it's so apparent, that these gatherings, hardcore gigs, allow men to construct rituals that in turn allowed them to touch the skin of other men. It's really so homoerotic, and nobody seems to speak about that. That would be my point.
Okay, first of all, questions, and I would say we'll start to answer them.
Yeah. That with this question about the hypothesis, straight edge, and slam dancing. It's rather a hypothesis, but the physicality of slam dancing makes it important for you to have a certain posture and have a certain muscle power, for example. And it's also like for the slam dancers, like to have controllable movements, so that the movements are not, in that sense, that dangerous that you really hurt somebody. So this is, I think, this is the connection. But there's not a necessarily connection. But I think there's a close association.
Maybe I will say something to the gender aspect. It's so that this in the documentaries that nowadays appear, many the direction is this, that they the few women who are in this scene at this time appears in this documentaries more than they appeared in the footage of the gigs nowadays. The scene is aware of this problem and now address it, but at this time it was definitely women were there were very few women in this scene and in the footage. And this description of wallflower is, I think, it's a self-description of one of these women, but in a later way. So I don't know exactly if it's an actual term of the time. And are we missing some questions?
Yeah, I think definitely like we have to look at Riot Girl in specific ways. Like when Kathleen Hanna started Bikini Kill, she definitely created these spaces for women and said girls up in front and the man had to go back. So this was the strategy, but it would take like 15 years from original hardcore to make that happen. And I think the most interesting time, this is why I looked at the 1980, from 1980 to 1982. This is where the shift happened. So as we heard yesterday, with like the first wave punk scene with a lot of women front singers, and then in hardcore there's almost no female band or female front singers. So this is really striking. And then in the beginning you still have some women say, oh, I prefer dancing, just simple dancing. I don't want to do slamming, I prefer dancing, okay. But then somehow they're more and more removed. There's some women who do stage diving, who do slam dancing, but somehow I think in between 1980 and 1982 it shifts to a more and more masculine form, and I think straight edge is such a hyper masculine form of everything, like of body discipline. So this is,
Prostitution.
Yeah.
To Sasha's question about like the geography of the scene, it's kind of hard to evaluate. I would say like Berlin is an exception. Obviously, East Berlin is an exception because it's the only real cosmopolitan place in the GDR and also by far the biggest city. But I would definitely confirm that heavy metal happens more rural parts of the country. I try to shed a light on that by naming a few places that come up in the archive files from Stasi. So it's like Kostitz, Ebersbrunn, Torgelow, Rögeheide, like places like that, like really small places, and still you would find heavy metal bands there. Outside of Berlin, the big center for heavy metal is the south of the GDR, Thuringia, and there are not the big cities like Suhl or Erfurt, which are like pretty small compared to Berlin, but even there, heavy metal happens in the villages, in the small parts of town. But it's like these places should, in the best case scenario, in the like suburbia, one would say, probably for the US. So it would be good to, be able to reach like the city, like proper city. Outside of Berlin, there's one exception, at least, when looking at the Stasi files, which is Karl-Marx-Stadt. So like a big industrial center with lots of working class people working in the industry. This is like a place that comes up on a regular basis. But yeah, it's all I can say, I guess, about it. To the Siegfried's question concerning the political context of ecstasy, and it's kind of hard to answer because we know very little about Western Germany and the heavy metal scene. There's not much research. There's ongoing research, but there's not much published. I think I would argue that the dispositive to become ecstatic was like stronger in the DDR because people had to put more into it to get to the gigs because there was always a certain kind of uncertainty whether the concert would happen, if the police would just decide to not let it happen, if the band would be well not arrested but just stopped from playing there. So if you reach a concert, you already overcame like certain dangers, and then you had to make it count. So you had to be ecstatic. And the biggest difference, obviously, this goes back to what I said before. When you are living in Western Germany or London or New York, you don't have to dream about being in the West, like you are already in the West. East Germans had like this imagined West in their minds and also on their bodies, and then they had this very specific transgressive nature of pop music concerts, I think, in the GDR, the late GDR.
Okay, thank you. And Bob?
Yes, I'd love to address the agency question because that is something that I definitely struggle with. But it is also tied to other threads of my research. To be sure, when we're thinking about material marginalization or erasure, getting high and forgetting about those problems isn't necessarily going to solve those problems. But there are a couple threads in my research that do kind of contribute to this notion of agency in a more perhaps productive, to use a terrible word there, way. One is through psychology, right? Material conditions producing anxiety, depression. There seems to be some indication that marijuana was used to alleviate some of those things, and certainly we know today it's being touted as treatment for those kinds of illnesses. The other kind of issue, though, that's really interesting is the economics of marijuana. Hosting a pad is a method of gaining some extra cash, right? Because you sell the drug in ways that small family units, small, often touted as drug rings, but very often not. But family units and other independent operators could make money, could find economic opportunity in hosting a pad, selling the drug, and my research kind of gets into some of that. So it does expand this notion, and it's a really great question about agency. And so hopefully we'll see something about that in my dissertation. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. So since we are kind of running out of time, I would say we have a last round of questions. So only the persons who are on my list have the right to ask other questions. Karl, Bodo, Juliane, and Josh. So this would be great to have the micro.
Thanks a lot, first of all, for the enlightening presentations. I have a question for Sebastian and Ralph, because I thought of a quote by Vic Bondi, which he gave to Martin Büsser, a German cultural studies guy and very active in the hardcore scene. And Bondi said that when soldiers were sent to Vietnam, they were cherries in the first place, and they had to be made hardcore. So I was thinking about is that is hardcore or being in mosh pit within hardcore gigs? Is that another form of the military being carried on, which also links to what Sasha said about the homoeroticism and the männerbündische aspect of that and so on. So that's a thing I've been thinking about for quite a long time, because the term hardcore itself is so complicated and so has so many different connotations. So yeah, that's my question. Thank you.
Okay, my question is for both. I wanted to ask about drug outcomes as cultural artifacts. Specifically, you mentioned sort of like the easing of burdens, and the word I find in my research really often is withdrawing. So I think that's an interesting parallel. But I wanted to contrast that with two things. So firstly, this easing of burdens, I wanted to contrast it with the idea of mania that the authorities were very worried about. And if these really animated, sort of excited states, were really common. And I also wanted to contrast the idea of using burdens with kind of the later hippie ideas about getting high. And I think we can sort of say that there was very different setting of life. And so the experiences were probably very different. But do we know in which way? And is it possible to really talk about people's subjective experiences differently between these two different groups? And lastly, if I can, on the agency point, I don't want to answer for Bob, but I just wanted to say that if people choose to sort of ease their burdens in some way and withdraw temporarily, even though it doesn't solve the problem, they're still choosing to do something, and it's their choice.
Yeah.
And I think agency in drug histories is kind of about not necessarily seeing people as victims of, addiction things. It's their choice to deal with the issues in this way, even if it doesn't solve the problem permanently. Thank you.
Great. Thank you.
Time's up. I make my question more a comment. I found the 3 papers very interesting because they really went into detail when is ecstasy created, with what practices, and at what time. And those 2 papers mentioning the mayor of New York and Nikolai talking about the Stasi records, I wonder to a certain degree, are we perhaps making the same mistake as those authorities in saying pop culture is all about ecstasy? That's what they're looking for. What makes it actually so different dancing 3 hours tango argentino in comparison to a mosh pit? And is ecstasy always the main goal of practicing music or going to a concert? I remember a scholar quoting from punk fanzines where the fans wrote their critiques of concerts, and actually they went like, for most of the time, it was so boring again, this band was so bad, worse than I expected, I was totally bored. So is it all about ecstasy, or does ecstasy only happen in a certain moment, or only in the mosh pit? But what about the other 400 people in the open air crowd? Are they all in ecstasy all the time? And then another question that struck me is when we all laughed and smiled about the amount of alcohol drunken by heavy metal fans or smoking reefer, that's kind of funny. But what's actually about hard drugs? We're only talking soft drugs all the time up to now. But thinking of the jazz musicians like Ray Charles, for example, was a heavy user of heroin and for his entire lifetime, and he died old. So that's perhaps a general question also for the following papers. What about those drugs? Yeah.
Yeah, I'll make it short, especially because my question is born out of ignorance and possibly worse autobiographical experience. I'm actually interested, and it relates a little bit to Moin's question. I'm interested in the Britishness of all the practices you have described. And as somebody who went to Oxford in the mid-90s and was thrown together with males of predominantly public schooling, as in the British sense of public schools, so private schools, single-sex education, suddenly it made complete sense to me that poking and all of that came out of that culture. So I'm kind of inviting you to, rather than globalize our topic, to possibly do the opposite and contextualize it again a little bit. I mean, as I say, I might be completely wrong, but it seems to me there's a much larger context of the whole British system of single-sex education, faggoting, intimacy but no intimacy, ex-territorial army, etc., etc. So I'd be happy to invest a bit about that.
Yeah, many questions. I will begin with a connection to the military. I found it a better expression for the movement out of the time where the many football references in the contest out of this time. So this military connection is not seen so much, and from scene to scene different. We have the New York hardcore scene in the early years where very precarious scene, and the more suburban scenes like Ralph presented. So you can not, this football reference in the suburban context is more saying the more scenes.
Yeah, maybe to add, there's also like the question that context matters. So each scene has a different kind of rule, set of rules, and how you connect with each other. But and it's also a question of rhetorics and reality. So in the rhetorics, in the lyrics, they say we hate war. War is worse. So they're all against Reagan and against all kinds of American interventions, wherever. So somehow they are against military, against police. But then what they're doing actually is having this self-discipline behavior. But then somehow I also don't want to over stress the importance of straight edge, because there was still a lot of hardcore scenes around that were drinking, just having fun, and doing what they were doing. So there's also like this plurality. So I wouldn't make the mistake to homogenize this as like one single scene. And then also about the question of, is it all about ecstasy? No, it isn't actually. In hardcore, it's all about the scene, supporting the scene. It's all about going to the gigs, even like they have really long gigs, like 5 to 8 bands playing, yeah, at one show, and people get heavily bored. Because like the music itself, no, it is boring. After half an hour, they played all the riffs they had. It's always the same chord progressions. They're not virtuos or musicians. It gets boring, yeah, definitely. And it's always the same anger, it's the same themes, and then it's also like it's this awkwardness that, yeah, you can't touch people because they're really young. And then it's footballer guys, and they don't know how to touch women, to get into contact with women. So what are they doing? Yeah, they're doing football, contact sport things to get closeness. Yeah, physical intimacy.
Hard drugs?
No hard drugs. No. Well, like in the first punk wave, the acid fishes and all this. But yeah, apart from that, no.
Okay, is it all about ecstasy? It is all about concerts. This is, at least this is what they say, like both bands and fans are saying, this is like the high point, this is the pinnacle, this is what we are working for, and this is kind of where it all comes together, like the emotional style, the clothes, and the music, obviously. And during this concert, is it all about ecstasy? No, probably not. I mean, we've seen on the pictures that not everybody is in ecstasy. But the expectations from the musicians, and I got a couple of statements regarding it, like a good concert is when everybody is flipping out, when everybody's having a ball. This is certainly this is certainly the success. And then, we got the source problem, because only when people are intoxicated or in ecstasy or something happens, they turn up in the Sternenpreis. So normal concert is probably not happening in those kind of sources. Hard drugs are largely absent in GBR. There is some fooling around with sleeping pills and vodka, but that's about it.
I'd be surprised, because Poland has a heavy drug problem, and Slovenia has a heavy drug problem.
No, I haven't noticed anything like some. I found some kind of homemade opium from a nurse from a hospital in Berlin, but that's about it.
So what was in the rest of Eastern Europe? Was this supposed to be heroin, which is basically the very dirty homemade heroin production? Yeah.
I haven't read anything about that or found it in the files. There's some of the punks are sniffing glue, which is cheap. Some marijuana coming in from Western Berlin, from it's always framed as a problem with the Turkish migrants in Western Berlin, but no heroin. No. Didn't matter.
Yeah. Just to address a couple of the things in terms of the question of agency. Yes. One of the books that I'm reminded of is Tim Mitchell's Intoxicated Identities, that talks about binge drinking cultures in rural Mexico. It's sort of along those same lines. This is my expression of agency, right? We have to sort of understand my expression of agency on my terms, and not on someone else's terms. And I think that's kind of one of the ways that we could think about agency, more than just sort of addressing a problem in a sort of standard way, right? The other issue is of heroin. One of the interesting things about marijuana history around this time is that it is very closely tied in with concerns about heroin. The obvious link that people are familiar with, the stepping stone theory, that marijuana leads to heroin, is kind of in the background of a lot of the anti-marijuana stuff, starting in before the 30s, to be honest, but especially after the 30s, after the Marijuana Tax Act, it becomes sort of easy to talk about marijuana and heroin kind of in the same breath. So I guess that's how those drugs kind of fit in. And I think that was it. I wasn't sure if there was any other direct questions for me.
We are already 12 minutes over time. That's okay. Let's just remember the one question you want to answer. So we have a lunch break now. It's almost 2 hours.